The moment Elvira Ford's knuckles rapped twice against the old barn door, soft and deliberate as a heartbeat, Orville Conroy's entire world shifted on its axis, and he would spend the rest of his life grateful for it. It was the spring of 1873, and the town of Caldwell Creek sat in the flat, windswept heart of southern Kansas like a coin dropped carelessly on a table. The railroad had come through 3 years prior, leaving behind a scatter of saloons, a general store that smelled perpetually of dried beans and pine resin, a post office no bigger than a closet, and a population of people who were either running towards something or running away from it. Orville Conroy had arrived 6 years ago with nothing more than a saddle horse, a bedroll, and $200 he'd earned driving cattle up from Texas. He had bought a modest parcel of land on the eastern edge of town, built a house that was small but sound, and spent years turning that parched Kansas earth into something that produced. He was 28 now, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that fell over his forehead when he forgot to cut it, and hands that were always stained with some honest labor soil, wood, horse liniment. He kept a small herd of cattle, grew wheat on 12 acres, and had a barn that he had built himself, plank by plank, which he regarded with a quiet personal pride. The barn was his sanctuary. Everyone in Caldwell Creek knew that. Men would wander in without ceremony to borrow a tool or ask about feed prices. Boys would sneak in to climb the loft rafters when they thought he wasn't watching. Even Sheriff Dale Pruitt had once walked straight into the barn mid-sentence, mid-chew, and helped himself to a seat on a hay bale while finishing whatever speech he'd started outside. Nobody knocked. It was a barn. People in Caldwell Creek didn't knock on barns. They didn't knock on much of anything, really. Orville had stopped expecting courtesy from the world a long time ago, not because he was bitter about it, but because the West had a way of teaching a man to accept things as they were. You didn't waste energy grieving the niceties that frontier life had stripped away. You put your head down and you worked, and if the world was rough around its edges, you sanded your own edges down to match. Elvira Ford knocked. 2 quiet, deliberate knocks against the old pine door of his barn on a Tuesday morning in April, when the Kansas air still held a bite of winter, and the meadowlarks were just beginning to remind everyone that warmth was coming. Orville had been inside, crouched beside his youngest mare, a gray roan named Juniper who had gone slightly lame in the right foreleg. He had been wrapping the leg with careful, measured strips of cloth soaked in a poultice his mother had taught him to make from comfrey root and beeswax, and he was so focused on the task that when the knocking came, he thought for a moment he had imagined it. He straightened up slowly and looked at the door. The knocking came again. 2 knocks. Patient, polite, certain of themselves. "Come in," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, pulled from somewhere deep where he kept words he didn't often use before noon. The door opened, and Elvira Ford stepped into his barn. He did not know her yet. She was simply a woman he had never seen before, standing in the thin morning light that fell through the open barn door, and his first impression of her was that she was not dressed for this town. She wore a practical traveling dress in a dark green wool that had seen 100 miles of road but had been carefully maintained. The hem was dusty, but the buttons were all present and polished. Her hair was dark brown, gathered at the nape of her neck in a way that was tidy without being precious, and her eyes were the color of creek water over brown stone, a kind of amber gray that was difficult to name. She was 25 years old, though he would not learn that for several days. She was not pretty in the way that the women in Harper's Weekly were pretty. She was better than that. She was the kind of woman who looked like she had never needed anyone to tell her she was worth looking at, which made her worth looking at considerably more. She was holding a piece of paper. "I beg your pardon," she said, and her voice was steady, like she was used to speaking to men who were crouched beside injured horses in dim barns. "My name is Elvira Ford. I have recently taken the position of schoolteacher at the Caldwell Creek School. I'm told this farm produces eggs, and I was hoping to arrange a weekly purchase. I apologize for the interruption." Orville stood up fully. He was aware distantly that he had poultice on his hands. "You knocked," he said. She blinked once. "Of course I knocked. It's your barn." He looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly longer than was socially customary. He was not staring at her the way men sometimes stared at women in this part of the world, with that assessing, possessive quality that made women hold their shoulders differently. He was staring at her the way a man stares at something he has been told does not exist, and then suddenly finds standing in front of him. "Most people just walk in," he said. "Most people are rude," she said without heat, simply as a matter of fact. He almost smiled. He caught it, kept it somewhere behind his teeth. "I do sell eggs, 2 dozen a week. Enough. More than enough. What do you charge?" 10 cents a dozen." "That's fair." She produced a small coin purse from her coat pocket and held it ready. "Should I come on Mondays, or would another day be more convenient for you?" He had never once in his life been asked what was convenient for him when it came to a commercial transaction. People just showed up. People just took what they needed and threw coins at him and walked away. "Monday is fine," he said. "I can leave them by the door if you'd rather not. Mondays I'll come by in person," she said. "I prefer to know where my food comes from. I find it makes meals more meaningful." He looked at her again with that same complicated expression. "Monday it is then, Miss Ford." "Thank you, Mr. Conroy," he said. "Orville Conroy." "Mr. Conroy." She gave a slight, unself-conscious nod, like a woman who had been raised with genuine courtesy and had simply never let the West beat it out of her. Then she stepped back and she pulled the barn door closed behind her as she left, not slamming it, just closing it, careful and clean. Orville stood in the dim barn with his poultice-stained hands at his sides and the scent of comfrey in the air, and he thought about those 2 quiet knocks for a long time. Elvira Ford had come to Caldwell Creek from Lawrence, Kansas, where she had spent 3 years teaching at a school that had twice the students and half the resources. Before Lawrence, she had been in St. Louis, where she had grown up in the kind of family that had books on the shelves and believed firmly in public education. Her father had been a surveyor, and her mother had been a quiet, fierce woman who had taught herself to read Latin just to prove she could. Elvira had inherited both her father's practicality and her mother's ferocity, which meant she was the kind of person who could walk into a rough Kansas town alone, with a trunk and a letter of appointment, and feel not afraid but simply alert. She had taken the position in Caldwell Creek because the salary was better than Lawrence, and because there were fewer children competing for any given book, which she found she preferred. She had rented a room above the dress shop, owned by a woman named Martha Gillies, who was broad and warm and laughed like a horse and made excellent pie. And within the first week, Elvira had assessed the town with the precision of someone accustomed to entering new territories. She noted the general store, run by a man named Bertram Oakes, who was honest about weights and somewhat less honest about credit. She noted the saloon, which was called the Silver Horn, and was always louder at 10 in the morning than seemed appropriate. She noted the school, a single-room building at the north end of the main street with 15 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, half of whom had never held a pencil with any confidence. She noted the livery, the post office, the small Baptist church whose minister was a former trail hand named Reverend Cobble, who preached with his sleeves rolled up. She noted the sheriff, Dale Prout, who was in his 50s, slow-moving and sharp-eyed in equal measure, and who chewed tobacco with the focused intensity of a man who had chosen one vice and was committed to mastering it. And she noted the farm on the eastern edge of town, where a man named Orville Conroy kept cattle and grew wheat and had a barn he had clearly built with his own hands because there was something personal in the way it stood, something in the proportions that was not purely functional but was also in some quiet way considered. She had asked Martha Gillies about him the day before she went to the barn. "Orville Conroy," Martha had said, setting down a bolt of calico. "Decent man. Quiet. Came here from somewhere south, Texas I think, maybe before that Tennessee. Doesn't cause trouble, doesn't go to the Silver Horn much. Had a wife years ago before he came here. She died." Fever, I think, or maybe childbirth. Nobody quite knows for certain because he doesn't speak of it. He doesn't speak of much, to be honest. Works hard, is fair with the people who work for him, sells eggs. Martha had paused and looked at Elvira with the particular attention of a woman who had been widowed herself and had learned to read the space between questions. Why? I need eggs, Elvira said simply. Martha had smiled in a way that Elvira had chosen to ignore. The first Monday came. Elvira walked the quarter-mile from the dress shop to Orville's farm in the early morning, when the sky was still pink and the grass along the road held dew that soaked the hem of her skirt through by the time she arrived. She knocked at the barn door again. She would always knock, and Orville was inside feeding the horses. He had the eggs already in a cloth-covered basket, as though he had expected her, which she supposed he had since she had told him Monday. They talked for 15 minutes that morning. Mostly about the school. He asked how many students she had, and when she told him 15, he said that seemed like a lot for one person, and she said it was, but that most things worth doing were a lot for one person. He had looked at her when she said that, and she had felt the weight of it but not shied from it. What do you teach them? He asked. Reading, mathematics, geography, history, some composition, whatever they need. Do you like it? Very much. Children ask the right questions. They haven't yet learned that asking questions is considered weakness. She paused. Adults could stand to relearn that. He handed her the basket. Their fingers did not touch. But the handoff was deliberate, and both of them were aware of it. The next Monday she came back, and the Monday after that. On the fourth Monday, Orville had coffee on, which he had never had ready for any of the other people who came to his farm. He didn't make a ceremony of it. He simply had 2 cups on the workbench. When she came in, she knocked. She always knocked, and he handed her one without much explanation, and she accepted it without making a fuss, and they stood in his barn with their backs against the workbench and drank coffee while the horses moved quietly in their stalls. He told her that morning that he had grown up in Tennessee, which confirmed what Martha had told her. He had come west after the war. He had been 15 when the war ended, too young to fight in it, which he said without particular relief, because plenty of boys his age in Tennessee had not been too young, and he carried that awareness with him. His family had been farmers. He had left at 17 because the land there was worn out and the economy was broken, and there was nothing left in Tennessee that felt like a future. He had driven cattle twice up the Kishom Trail, which was how he had arrived in Kansas, and Caldwell Creek had been the place where he had finally stopped and decided to build something that belonged to him. He told her all of this in a plain, quiet way, like he was reciting facts that he had long since made peace with, and Elvira listened with the focused attention she gave to everything, and when he finished she said, I think the bravest thing a person can do is decide that a place is worth staying in. He looked at her over his coffee cup. Have you done that? Not yet, she said honestly. But I'm deciding. Something moved in his expression. He put it away before it became readable, but she had seen it. She was a woman who noticed things. By the 5th Monday, she had learned that he read. This was not common knowledge about Orville Conroy, and perhaps that was because he never mentioned it. But when she arrived that morning, she found him with a novel open on his workbench. It was Mark Twain's The Innocents Abroad, published 4 years prior, the spine already soft from multiple readings. She had exclaimed over it with a genuine delight that surprised him, and they had talked for nearly an hour about books, and he had revealed that he owned 16 of them, which in a place like Caldwell Creek in 1873 was a small personal library of remarkable proportions. You have 16 books, she said, and the wonder in her voice was not performed. I have 17 now, he said, slightly self-conscious about it. I ordered one from the catalog last month, came in on Wednesday. What did you order? He hesitated. History of Rome. She stared at him. You ordered a history of Rome. Is that strange? It is extraordinary, she said with great sincerity. In the best possible way. He looked at his boots. It was the first time she had seen him look away from her in anything that resembled discomfort. She thought it might be that he was not accustomed to being found extraordinary, and did not entirely know what to do with it. She liked that about him considerably. It was toward the end of May, on a Saturday when Elvira had no school, that she encountered the trouble that had been simmering in Caldwell Creek for some months, and which she had not yet fully understood. She was at Bertram Oak's general store picking up chalk and a new primer, when two men came in off the street with the kind of deliberate carelessness that means someone is performing confidence they do not entirely feel. They were cowboys who rode for a man named Hackett, who owned a large ranch to the west of town, and who had a way of conducting himself as though the town existed for his convenience. One of the cowboys, a red-faced man with a name she'd later learn was Dykes, walked to the counter and told Bertram Oaks in front of 3 other customers that Hackett was extending his credit another month and that Bertram could write it down or Hackett could take his business to the store in Pratt. Bertram, who was not a cowardly man but who was a practical one, wrote it down. The cowboys left. Elvira stood with her chalk and looked at Bertram. "Does that happen often?" she asked. Bertram shrugged with the particular weariness of a man who has been shrugging about the same thing for years. "Hackett does as he pleases. And Sheriff Prout does what he can." Bertram lowered his voice. "Hackett has 12 men riding for him and Prout has 1 deputy who is 19 years old." Elvira thought about this as she walked back through town. She thought about power, and about the way it moved through places like this, and about the men and women and families, including several of her students and their parents, who lived in the radius of a man like Hackett and had to calculate every morning how much of their dignity they could afford to spend before sundown. She thought about Orville, whose farm sat east of town, relatively far from Hackett's land, and whether he had had his own dealings with the Hackett situation. She found out on the following Monday. She knocked at the barn door and he said, "Come in," and when she entered she found him talking to a man she had not met before, a lean, sun-darkened man in his 40s named Clarence Webb, who worked a small farm a mile north and who had the look of someone who had recently received bad news. He had, in fact. Hackett's men had pushed 3 of Webb's cattle off his land onto the main road the night before, and one had been injured enough that it needed to be put down. This was the 4th time in 6 months that something belonging to Clarence Webb had been damaged in a way that could not be directly attributed to Hackett, but which both men clearly understood. Orville noticed her in the doorway and made a small motion with his hand that meant, not asking her to leave, but rather acknowledging that she had arrived in the middle of something. She came in anyway and set her basket down and listened, because she was the kind of woman who believed that listening was itself a form of participation. When Clarence left, Orville stood with his hands on the workbench, and there was a tightness around his jaw that she had not seen before. "How long has Hackett been doing this?" she asked. He looked at her. "You know about Hackett?" "I pay attention." He was quiet for a moment, and she saw him deciding how much to say. He decided to say a lot, which she thought was the right choice. He told her that Hackett had arrived in Caldwell Creek 4 years ago with money that nobody could account for and had bought land aggressively, some of it legitimately and some of it through pressure and what amounted to legal extortion. Several smaller farms had already sold to him at prices below their value, because the alternative was endless harassment. Orville had so far been left largely alone because his land was in the opposite direction from where Hackett was expanding, but Clarence Webb was directly in the path of it, and Orville was not a man who could watch that happen without it costing him something. "Is there legal recourse?" Elvira asked. "Prout has written to the county office twice. Nothing has come of it." "Then write to the state. Write to the land commissioner in Topeka." She paused. "I can help with that. I know how to write the kind of letter that produces a response." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why would you do that?" "Because Clarence Webb has 3 children, 2 of whom are my students, and I will not teach children by day and watch their family's land be stolen by night and call that acceptable." He had nothing to say to that. He simply looked at her with an expression that had moved past the point where he could easily keep it composed, and after a moment he nodded once, slow and certain, like a man making a decision he would not be reversing. They wrote the letter together the following Sunday. He had a desk in his house, a small room off the main one, and she sat across from him at a kitchen table with paper and pen, and he told her what he knew about Hackett's activities, and she organized it and shaped it and wrote it out in the kind of clear, formal language that government offices respond to. He watched her write and said very little, and she was aware of his watching but did not perform for it. When she finished and read it back to him, he was quiet. "You write the way you talk," he said finally, "like you mean it. Most people don't write what they mean," she said. "They write what sounds reasonable. Is there a difference?" "An enormous one," he smiled. She saw it fully this time, all of it, and it was a good smile. It was not a handsome man's smile designed to be seen, but a private person's smile, one that meant something had reached him past the usual defenses. It changed his face completely. She thought, quietly and without announcement, that she was in considerable trouble. They sent the letter to Topeka the next morning. Through June, the Mondays continued and the conversations grew longer. She told him about her mother, and he listened with the focused care of someone who understood that when people tell you about the people they have lost, they are telling you about themselves. She told him about the school she had attended in St. Louis, the debates she had had with teachers who believed girls only needed enough education to run a household. She told him about the books she loved and the ones she had found disappointing, and the one she had thrown across a room, Little Women, which she otherwise admired, for a specific scene near the end that she found philosophically offensive. He laughed at that. A real laugh, deep and startled, and she collected it like a thing of value. He told her about the cattle drives, about the nights on the open plains under skies so vast and full of stars that you stopped feeling lonely and started feeling something closer to erased, which he said was not entirely unpleasant. He told her about the men he had ridden with, some good and some not, and about a friendship he had formed with a Tejano vaquero named Mateo, who had been a better horseman than anyone Orville had ever known, and who had died of a snakebite 3 days north of San Antonio in the summer of 1869. He told her about it simply and without drama, but she heard what was underneath it, the particular quality of grief that belongs to the loss of a man who understood you, and she recognized it because she had her own version of it. She did not yet know about his wife. Martha had mentioned it briefly, but Elvira had not pressed, and Orville had not offered. It was the one territory between them that they had not yet entered, and she could feel its edges in the conversations, the places where he would stop just before a certain point and redirect himself, not evasively but carefully, the way a man steps around a hole in the road that he has stepped in before and does not intend to step in again. She did not push. She was not that kind of woman. She had her own territories she was not ready to walk into, and she respected his. It was in early July, on a Wednesday evening, that Hackett's man Dykes came to Orville's farm. Elvira was not there. She knew about it because Orville told her on the following Monday, and because Martha Gillies had heard from 3 different people by Thursday morning, which was how information moved in Caldwell Creek. What happened was this. Dykes rode up to the farm in the early evening and told Orville that Hackett was interested in purchasing the eastern acreage, not all of Orville's land, just the 12 wheat acres, at a price that was about 60% of market value, and that Hackett would be much obliged if Orville would consider the offer. Dykes had said this in a pleasant, even tone, which made it more threatening rather than less, because they were both aware of the grammar underlying it, the unspoken clause that followed every sentence Hackett's men spoke. Orville had told Dykes, politely and without excessive decoration, that his land was not for sale. Dykes had nodded pleasantly and ridden away. When Orville told Elvira this on Monday, she watched his face carefully for fear or uncertainty and found neither. What she found instead was a kind of settled resolve, the expression of a man who has already decided where his lines are and is not particularly worried about having to defend them. "Have you told Prout?" she asked. Prout knows. I rode to his office Thursday morning. Good, she thought for a moment. Has there been any reply from Topeka? Not yet. I expect it takes time. I'll write a follow-up letter this week. Sometimes they need to understand that someone is watching the correspondence. He looked at her with that expression again, the one she had been collecting, the one that was layered with things he had not yet said. Elvira, he said. It was the first time he had used her name, not Miss Ford, her name. She felt it land. Yes, she said, even though he had not yet said what came after her name. I want you to know, he said, that I am aware of what you have done with the letter and he started again. I am not accustomed to having someone in my corner who thinks as clearly as you do. She looked at him for a moment. I think you deserve that, she said. Someone in your corner. He looked away. Out through the barn door at the summer Kansas morning, at the wheat standing tall in the distance. She watched the line of his jaw and the way he held his shoulders and thought about all the years he had spent building this farm alone, making something out of this flat, indifferent land entirely on the strength of his own will, with no one watching, no one to tell him it was good work. You have a history of Rome waiting on your desk, she said, gently, redirecting them both. What do you think of Cicero? He turned back to her with that private smile, and the tension broke like a cloud releasing rain, and they talked about Cicero for the rest of the morning. In the second week of July, a woman named Agnes Prout, the sheriff's wife, came to find Elvira at the school after the children had gone home. Agnes was a round, energetic woman with strong opinions about almost everything, and a genuine warmth that made her opinions tolerable. She sat in one of the student chairs, which was too small for her, and told Elvira in a direct, no-ceremony way that she had noticed that Elvira had been spending a fair amount of time at Orville Conroy's farm, and that she thought this was the most interesting development in Caldwell Creek in at least 3 years, and that she was, Agnes personally, entirely in favor of it. Elvira raised an eyebrow. I know how that sounds, Agnes said without regret, but you should know about his wife, not because it's your business, strictly speaking, but because it'll help you understand him, and understanding him is the whole challenge, because he is a fundamentally good man who has decided to make himself difficult to reach on purpose. Elvira set down her chalk. Tell me. Her name had been Clara. She had been Orville's wife for 2 years. They had married when he was 22, before Caldwell Creek, before Kansas, when he had been working at a ranch in Missouri. She had been 20 years old and had loved him in the way that some young women love men who are serious and quiet, and seem to contain more depth than they are willing to show, fully and without sufficient self-preservation. She had died in the winter of their second year of marriage, in January of 1867, of a fever that moved through the county that winter and took several people. She had been carrying their first child at the time. Neither of them survived. He came to Caldwell Creek a year after, Agnes said. He was 23. He built that farm and he put everything he was into it, and I think for a long time the building was the point, not the having. You understand the difference? Yes, Elvira said quietly. He is 33 years old, Agnes said. He is lonely in a way that he has mistaken for preference, and he looks at you like. She stopped, looked at her own hands. Well, I have said enough. You have, Elvira agreed, but she said it without displeasure. After Agnes left, she sat in the empty schoolroom for a long time, with the late afternoon light coming in flat and golden through the windows, thinking about a woman named Clara who had been 20 years old and had loved a serious, quiet man, and about the particular weight that loss leaves inside a person, not as a barrier but as a kind of furniture you arrange your life around, that eventually you forget is not supposed to be there. She thought about what she felt when she walked into his barn on Monday mornings, the specific, grounded quality of it, the feeling of arriving somewhere that mattered. She made herself be honest about it, the way she was honest about everything, and what she found when she was honest was that she had been falling in love with Orville Conroy for approximately 6 weeks, slowly and without her full permission, the way rivers move, quietly, steadily, in the direction that is simply down. She knocked on his barn door the next Monday, and he called come in, and she entered, and there was coffee waiting, and he was brushing Juniper, whose leg had healed well, and he looked up when she came in with the expression that he always wore when she arrived, the one that tried to be simply acknowledging and was in fact something considerably warmer. "How is the leg?" she asked. "Good as new," he said. "Better, maybe." She set her basket down and accepted the coffee and leaned against the workbench and looked at him brushing the horse with the steady, sure strokes of a man who knew exactly how much pressure the animal needed and provided it without ego or ceremony, and she thought, "I want to tell him." She did not tell him that day. She had been raised to believe that love was not a performance and should not be rushed, and there were things between them still unresolved, most notably Hackett and the farm, and she thought that the right moment was not the same as the available moment. The reply from Topeka came in the last week of July. It was addressed to both Orville Conroy and a Miss E. Ford of Caldwell Creek, which meant that someone in the land commissioner's office had read the letter carefully enough to identify both signatories. The letter stated that an inquiry into land practices in and around Caldwell Creek had been opened, that a representative would be dispatched to the area within 60 days, and that any additional documentation of alleged harassment or coercive practices should be forwarded to the office immediately. Orville came to the school to show her the letter. He had never come to the school before. He walked in during the noon recess when the children were outside and she was eating an apple at her desk and reading, and he stood in the doorway. He had knocked. Of course he had knocked. She noted this with a warm amusement, with the letter in his hand and an expression that was trying not to be too much and was too much anyway. She read the letter. She read it again. 60 days, she said. At the most. It could be sooner. Then we should have everything ready. Every instance we know about, with dates and names where possible. I'll speak to Clarence Webb and to the other families. I've already spoken to Clarence, he said. And to a man named Harlan Peters who sold his eastern pasture to Hackett last year for less than it was worth. He'll testify if needed. She looked at him over the letter. You have been busy. I had a good example, he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite humor but was adjacent to it. She wanted to fold the letter up and go with him somewhere and tell him every single thing she had been thinking since April, since 2 knocks on a barn door. Since a man who looked at her like she was something that should not exist but did. Instead she said, "Have some of my apple," and held it out across the desk, and he took it and bit into it and handed it back, and they sat in the quiet schoolroom and talked about the letter and what it meant, and neither of them looked directly at the other for very long because the looking had started to carry too much current to be safe. Clarence Webb's situation worsened in August. 3 of his fence posts were found cut on a Wednesday morning. Not knocked over, not fallen, cut deliberately with a tool in the night. 2 of his cattle wandered through the gap, and one was found a quarter-mile away on the boundary of Hackett's land. And when Clarence went to retrieve it, 2 of Hackett's riders were there to tell him, pleasantly, that this kind of thing could become a real problem if a man's fences weren't kept up better. Prout came out and documented it. Elvira sat with the Webb family that evening and helped the mother, a thin, exhausted woman named Ruth, write a formal complaint. Ruth Webb cried quietly at the kitchen table while Elvira wrote, not from weakness but from the accumulated fatigue of years of exactly this kind of thing. And Elvira wrote it all down, the dates, the incidents, the conversations, the pattern of it, and sent it off to Topeka the following morning alongside a cover letter from herself stating clearly that the situation was escalating and that the timeline of 60 days was no longer acceptable. Orville rode with her to the post office that morning. They walked their horses side by side through the main street of Caldwell Creek, and it was the first time they had been seen together in public in a way that was clearly not incidental, and Elvira noted the looks, not hostile, mostly curious, a few warmly approving, and chose not to care about any of them. You are the most determined person I have ever met, Orville said as they left the post office. I prefer effective, she said. Both, he said. You are both. She looked at him, and he looked back, And the main street of Caldwell Creek in the August morning heat was entirely the wrong place for what was almost said between them, but almost said it anyway. That evening, after she had returned to her room above the dress shop and eaten the supper Martha had left for her and sat with a book she was not reading, she made a decision. She made it the way she made most significant decisions, directly, without a great deal of prolonged negotiating with herself, because she found that the negotiating rarely changed the outcome and simply delayed it. She would tell him on the next Monday. The next Monday was the 21st of August, and it was hot the way Kansas August is hot, which is a total and suffocating heat that has no mercy in it. She walked to the farm in the early morning before the worst of it set in and knocked on the barn door, and he called, "Come in," and she came in. He was not at the workbench or with the horses. He was at the far end of the barn, standing in the wide rear doorway that opened onto the back pasture, looking out at the field. His back was to her. He stood with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders very still, and she knew immediately that something had happened. She went to him. She stood beside him in the doorway and looked at the field. In the wheat field, perhaps 50 yards into it, a section of stalks had been trampled, not by whether the rest of the field was untouched. By boots or by horses ridden through deliberately in the night. The damage was not devastating to the crop overall, but it was a message. "When?" she asked. "Sometime last night," he said. His voice was very quiet. "I found it at first light." She stood beside him and looked at the ruined section, maybe 30 square yards of standing wheat flattened to the ground, and felt the cold anger of it, the calculated, casual cruelty of a man like Hackett telling another man that his work could be undone in the dark of a night, just to make the point. "Have you told Prout? He came out an hour ago, documented it. He looks tired, Elvira." He paused. "He's a good man in a situation that's too big for what he has." She turned to look at Orville's profile, the set of his jaw, the controlled quality of whatever he was feeling. "The representative from Topeka will come," she said. "This is more evidence, not less." "I know that," he said. He turned to look at her, and his face was stripped of the usual careful management. He looked tired and angry and something else, something older underneath both of those, the expression of a man asking himself how much a thing is worth. "I built this," he said, quietly, gesturing at the barn, the field, the house behind them. "I built every board of that barn, and I turned every acre of that field. 11 years. I know," she said. "I'm not afraid of Hackett," he said, "but I am tired of him." She reached out and put her hand on his arm, just for a moment, just the steady, certain pressure of her hand on the worn cotton of his sleeve. He looked down at it and then up at her, and there was something in his face that was enormous and quiet, like a country you can see from a distance but have not yet been allowed to enter. She did not plan what she said next. She had planned something very different, something careful and organized, the kind of declaration that was sensible and clear. What came out was, "I am in love with you." It went into the August morning air and stayed there, very plain, very final. He looked at her for what felt like a long time but was probably 6 seconds. "I know," he said. And then, because he was not a man who knew how to be dishonest about the things that mattered, "I am in love with you too." They looked at each other in the back doorway of the barn, with the flattened wheat in front of them and the clear Kansas sky overhead, and it was not how she had imagined it. It was better. It was completely without ceremony and absolutely full of weight, and she thought it was the most honest moment she had ever inhabited. He put his hand over hers on his arm, and they stood there for a while, just standing, and it was enough, and they both knew it was enough. He said, "I have not told you about my wife." "You don't have to," she said. "I want to," he said. "I want you to know, not because you need to know it, but because it's mine and I want it to be yours too." So he told her. He told her about Clara, about Missouri, about the winter, about January of 1867, and he told it plainly, without making himself the tragic figure, simply telling her what had happened and what it had done to him, and how he had put it somewhere inside himself and built this farm on top of it, and how for a long time he had thought that was the right thing to do. And then she had knocked on his barn door in April, and he had thought. What had he thought? "I thought," he said carefully, "that the world was perhaps not finished with me yet." She turned her hand over under his so their hands were properly joined. "It is absolutely not," she said. The representative from Topeka, a methodical man named Assessor Holt, arrived in Caldwell Creek in the first week of September, 2 weeks ahead of the 60-day window. He was a small, neat, precise man with a leather case full of papers and a manner that suggested he had done this before and was not impressed by either the grandeur of Western land barons or their methods. He spent 4 days in Caldwell Creek, during which he spoke to Orville, to Clarence Webb, to Harlan Peters, to Sheriff Prout, and to several other residents. He spent a portion of one afternoon speaking to Elvira, who gave him the full, organized timeline she had assembled over the preceding weeks. Holt looked at it for some time. "You have done my job for me," he said. "I hope to make yours easier," she said. "Miss Ford," he said, "if I had someone with your organizational abilities in my office, I could close 4 open cases before Christmas." He departed on a Friday, and the town waited. Orville and Elvira waited together. They had settled into something that was no longer ambiguous, though it was not yet formally named in the way that Caldwell Creek would require it to be named in order to be entirely comfortable with it. He came to the school twice that September and sat in on a lesson. She was teaching American history, and the students were fascinated by the man who sat in the back and who turned out to be the person who had actually driven cattle up the Kishom Trail, not just read about it. He answered their questions with the same plain patience he gave to everything, and she watched him from the front of the room and thought, "This is the man." She walked to his farm on Saturdays now, not only Mondays, and he would sometimes meet her on the road when he saw her coming and walk back with her, and they would walk the dusty Kansas road side by side in the late afternoon sun, and the talking was easy and the silence was easy, which she had always thought was the real test. Martha Gillies asked, with great restraint for someone of her personality, whether there was an understanding between them. "There is," Elvira said. Martha pressed both hands to her face in a gesture of absolute satisfaction. Agnes Prout simply said, "Good," when she found out, and then immediately began suggesting they use the church, which Elvira noted privately for future consideration. On a Wednesday in late September, word came back from Topeka. The Land Commissioner's office had opened a formal legal proceeding against Gerald Hackett for coercive land acquisition, fencing violations, and destruction of private property. Hackett was required to appear before a county magistrate in Pratt to answer the charges. In the interim, his operations were to be reviewed, and he was instructed to cease all activity on or near the properties of Orville Conroy, Clarence Webb, and a list of 5 other named landowners. Prout read the notice at the post office with the focused stillness of a man trying not to express too much satisfaction all at once. Elvira read her copy and felt the specific, clean satisfaction of effective action, of having put words in the right places and pointed them at the right people. Orville found out when she came to his farm that morning. It was not Monday. It was a Wednesday, and she had come specifically to tell him. She knocked at the barn door and he called, "Come in," and she came in and handed him the paper and watched his face as he read it. When he finished, he looked up at her. "That is your work," he said. "Your letter, your organization." "It's our work," she said. "You knew the facts. I just arranged them." "There is nothing just about the way you arrange things," he said. He came around the workbench and stood very close to her and looked at her for a long moment, and then he kissed her, and it was the first time, and it was thoughtful and deliberate and entirely like him, full of everything he had not yet said and was now saying in the way that was clearest to him. When he stepped back, she looked at him with shining eyes that she did not attempt to contain. "Clarence Webb still needs his fences repaired," she said. He laughed, the full, surprised laugh that she had been collecting since May, and it sounded better every time. "Saturday," he said. "I'll take the lumber over Saturday." "I'll come," she said, Ruth Webb makes very good cornbread and she deserves the company." He looked at her, this woman who had arrived in his barn in April and knocked on the door, who had written letters to Topeka and sat with a crying woman at a kitchen table and argued about Cicero and offered him half of her apple, who had told him she loved him in a flat voice as though it were something she had assessed and verified and decided to report accurately. And he thought about how long he had lived inside himself and what it had cost him and what it would have continued to cost him if she had not come. "Stay for supper," he said. "I'll cook." She raised an eyebrow. "Can you cook adequately? That is very different from well. I am working on it." "I will teach you," she said, and meant it as two different things at once. Supper turned out to be better than adequately and not quite well. A piece of salt pork with beans from his garden and cornbread that was only slightly denser than it should have been. And they ate it at his kitchen table with the windows open to the September evening air and the sound of the horses in the barn and the crickets starting up in the grass. And she told him about the school, and he told her about the wheat harvest that would begin in 2 weeks. And she said she wanted to watch the harvest, and he said it was not particularly glamorous, and she said neither was anything worth doing, and he said she had a point. After supper she stayed and they sat on the porch and watched the stars come out over the Kansas plain, and the sky was enormous and full of light the way he had described it from the cattle drives, vast and indifferent and also somehow intimate, the way a thing can be when you are watching it with the right person. "When I drove cattle," he said, "I used to think about what I was going toward, whether there was something at the end of all the moving, a place that was mine." He paused. "I spent years building this place and thinking it was the answer, and it wasn't quite. It was close, but not quite." She looked at him. "I think the answer was never the place," he said. "I think it was a person." She reached over in the dark and found his hand and held it, and he held it back, and they sat on the porch of his house in the September night with the stars and the crickets and the smell of the Kansas earth after harvest, and it was everything. October came in cold and bright, and the wheat harvest was done in the first 2 weeks of it, and Elvira did watch, standing on the edge of the field in her coat with her hair coming loose from its pins in the wind, and it was not glamorous at all, and it was also one of the most satisfying things she had ever witnessed, the systematic labor of it, the visible result of it. Orville moving through his own field with 2 hired men, with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times and knew exactly how much each acre would yield. She brought lunch on the 3rd day. She had made it herself, bread from Martha Gillies's kitchen, which Martha had supervised and which had turned out well, and sliced cold beef and dried apple pie. She brought it out to the field in a basket, and they ate sitting on the cut wheat ground in the October sunshine, the 3 men and her. And the hired men were shy with her at first, and then were not, because she asked them about their families and their plans with the frankness that won people over. And by the end of lunch, they were telling her jokes that were only slightly appropriate, and she laughed at them appropriately. And Orville watched her with the steady look of a man taking inventory of his fortune. Hackett's hearing before the magistrate in Pratt was held in November. Pruitt attended. Clarence Webb attended. Orville drove to Pratt for the day, and Elvira could not go because it was a school day and she would not leave her students, but she sent documentation with Orville and told him to hand it directly to the magistrate's clerk. The outcome was significant. Hackett did not lose all of his land or his operation. The law in 1873 Kansas was not so comprehensive, but he received a formal judgment against him, a substantial fine, and a clear instruction from the county regarding his conduct toward neighboring landowners. The judgment was entered into the public record, which meant that anyone investigating a purchase from Hackett in the future would find it. It meant that his method of operation had been officially named and officially sanctioned, and in a territory where reputation was currency, it was a meaningful blow. Orville came home from Pratt in the late evening and rode directly to the dress shop and knocked on the street door, which Martha answered. eyebrows already raised, and asked if Elvira was available. She came down the stairs in her house robe with her hair down, which she had never allowed him to see before, and she stopped halfway down when she saw his face, which was carrying more expression than it usually allowed itself. "He got the judgment," she said immediately. "He got the judgment," Orville confirmed. "Fined significantly. Formal record." She sat down on the stair step. Just sat down where she was, on the fourth step from the bottom, with her hair down and her hands on her knees and an expression of profound, exhausted relief. He came to the bottom of the stairs and crouched to be level with her and said, "You did that." "We did that," she said firmly. "All of us. Webb and Peters and Prout and Elvira." He said her name the way he had learned to say it, with the particular attention he gave to things he was taking seriously. "You wrote the letter. You organized the evidence. You wrote the follow-up. The assessor told Prout that the quality of documentation was the reason the case moved as quickly as it did. It was you." She looked at him on the stairs in Martha Gillies's shop, with the lamplight from the upper floor coming down and her hair loose and his face open in a way that it almost never was. "Then I am very glad," she said, "that I needed eggs." He laughed, sudden and full. Martha, watching from the kitchen doorway, turned around and walked back to her kettle with a smile she had no intention of sharing with anyone. He came onto the step and sat beside her on the fourth stair. Two adults on a narrow stair in the dim light, shoulders touching, and they stayed there for a while, just being glad together, which was its own kind of happiness. 3 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon in November, when the first hard freeze had come, and the Kansas sky was the color of pewter and the wind had a knife in it, Orville Conroy asked Elvira Ford to marry him. He did not make a production of it. He was not a man who made productions. What he did was come to her on a Sunday afternoon walk. They had been walking the road between his farm and the town, which they did on Sundays when the weather allowed, which was their version of a ritual. And he stopped walking and turned to face her and said, in the plain, unornamented way he said everything that was true to him, "I would like very much to marry you, if you'll have me." She looked at him for a moment, this man who had built a barn with his hands and ordered a history of Rome from a catalog, and grieved a woman named Clara and driven cattle through a night sky full of stars, and learned to have coffee ready on Monday mornings. "I will have you," she said. "With very great pleasure." He produced a ring from his coat pocket, which was a small gold band that had belonged to his mother, which he had carried from Tennessee in a tobacco tin for 16 years, and he put it on her finger, and she looked at it and then up at him and said, "Your mother's ring. She would have wanted you to have it," he said. "I'm certain of it." She kissed him there on the road, with the November wind and the pewter sky and the Kansas plain stretching out in every direction. And it was the kind of kiss that has history in it. All the weeks of coffee in the barn, and all the letters to Topeka, and all the conversations about Cicero and Mark Twain and the nights on the cattle drives, all of it condensed into one point and pressed forward. They were married in the Caldwell Creek Baptist Church on the 30th of December, 1873, which meant they had known each other less than a year, which Martha Gillies said was fast, and Agnes Prout said was about time. Reverend Cobble performed the ceremony with his sleeves rolled up in deference to the ceremony but his collar firmly on, and the whole of Caldwell Creek that was not hostile or indifferent appeared to attend, including Clarence Webb and his family, who had fixed his fences and whose cattle were undisturbed, and who came in their good clothes, with Ruth Webb wearing a hat that had a blue ribbon on it and crying happily throughout. Elvira wore her mother's pearl brooch on the collar of a dress in dark blue wool that Martha had altered to fit her, and Orville wore a suit that he had ordered from a tailor in Wichita, and which fit him well in the shoulders and less well in the length of the legs, which was simply a problem of ordering things by mail, and which Elvira found, privately, entirely endearing. She walked down the aisle of the little church on her own, because she had no father present to walk with her, and because She had decided that she had been walking on her own for long enough that it seemed dishonest to pretend otherwise at the last moment. And when she reached the front where Orville stood, his expression was the expression she had been trying to describe to herself since April, the one she had been collecting, and she finally understood what it was. It was the face of a man who has been given back something he had convinced himself was gone. Reverend Cobble spoke about the nature of partnership, about how the best marriages were built on the same principles as the best land, cleared honestly, worked steadily, and tended with patience when the seasons were hard. He looked at both of them when he said it, and Orville's jaw moved slightly with something he was keeping to himself, and Elvira's eyes were bright, and neither of them looked away from the other. When the ceremony was done, the whole church erupted in a sound that was probably too loud for a Baptist establishment, and which Reverend Cobble forgave on the grounds that joy was a kind of worship. They moved into his house together in the new year. She brought her trunk and her books, 14 books, which when combined with his 17 made 31, which was a private library that made both of them quietly proud, and they arranged them on a set of shelves he had built against the south wall of the main room over the Christmas week. She brought her writing desk, which was smaller than his, and which they decided to put in the window that faced east, where the light came in clean in the mornings. The school continued. She had never intended to stop teaching, and Orville had never suggested it, which was one of the many things she loved about him. He understood that the school was not her profession but her vocation, the way the farm was not merely his occupation but his expression, and they were each unreservedly the other's champion in this. Martha Gillies became the nearest thing to family they had in Caldwell Creek, and the Sunday dinners at her table became a fixture of their weeks, loud and well-fed. Agnes and Dale Prout were their other constants, reliable as weather, and it was Dale who told them in the spring of 1874 that word from the county indicated that Hackett had sold 2 of his outlying parcels, sold them, not seized them, and was conducting his remaining operations with a notable new restraint that several residents had observed. Not because he had become a better man, but because the legal record was there now and he knew it. And some men learn from consequence when they will not learn from conscience. "You two did that," Prout said, over Martha's supper table, looking from Elvira to Orville with the frank appreciation of a man who had spent too long waiting for the right kind of help. Clarence Webb's farm grew. By the spring of 1874, he had 12 cattle, and his eldest son, a boy named Thomas who was in Elvira's school, was the best reader in the class by a considerable margin, a fact that Clarence acknowledged by arriving at Elvira's door one April morning with a very good wheel of hard cheese, and the specific speechless gratitude of a man whose child has been given something that will outlast the season. In March of 1874, Elvira discovered she was with child. She told Orville on a Monday morning. Not in the barn, he had come in for breakfast and she was at the stove and he had been talking about the seedlings in the east plot, and she turned around from the stove and said, "Orville, I am expecting a child." He went very still. She watched his face, waiting, because she knew his history and she was not unaware that this news had a complicated geography for him, that there was a room inside him where it would land differently than it might land in a man who had not already lost a wife and a child on the same cold January morning. He crossed the kitchen and put his hands on her face, both hands, gently, the way she had seen him handle the roan mare Juniper's injured leg, with exactly the right amount of pressure, and he looked at her for a moment that she would remember for the rest of her life. "Are you well?" he said. "I am perfectly well," she said. "Are you happy?" he said. "I am extraordinarily happy," she said. He let out a breath that had clearly been held for some time. Then he put his arms around her, full and unhurried, and she put her face against his shoulder, and they stood in the kitchen with the smell of breakfast and the March light coming in the east window, and she felt him exhale the last of whatever he had been bracing against, the old grief that had lived in him like a splinter, and felt it release. "I will be beside you," he said into her hair. Every day of it, every hour. I know that, she said. I have always known that. Their son was born in October of 1874, a solid, furious boy who arrived in the world at 4 in the morning, with the full-throated announcement of someone who had decided very early to make his presence felt. Agnes Prout, who had experience with these matters and had stayed the night, called him a fine boy and meant it fully. The doctor who came up from Pratt confirmed it. They named him James Orville Conroy, James for Elvira's father, who had been a surveyor and who had believed in the importance of knowing exactly where you stood, and Orville for the man who had built this farm board by board out of a flat Kansas field, because he believed that a life could be constructed if you were willing to do the work of it. Orville held his son for the first time in the gray October dawn while Elvira slept, and he sat in the chair by the window with the boy on his chest and the Kansas morning coming up outside, and he allowed himself, in private, to feel the full weight of it. The years of building and the years of solitude and Clara's absence and all the long cold winters that had preceded this October morning, and the particular, unreasonable gift of the present moment. He thought about a woman who had knocked on his barn door. He thought about that knock, those 2 quiet, deliberate knocks, and how no one else in Caldwell Creek had ever done it. He thought about what it had said about her, that single courtesy, that she understood that a man's space was his space, that she came to his world with respect and without assumption, that she was not in the habit of taking what had not been offered. He thought about how he had looked at her standing in the barn door in her traveling dress and thought, impossibly, here is someone I have not met before, and had not understood at the time what he was really thinking. He thought about all of it in the October dawn while his son breathed on his chest, and he was as grateful as a man can be. Elvira recovered well and was back at the school by January, which she had arranged with great organizational precision. She had trained an older student, a 14-year-old girl named Harriet Chen, whose father had come to Kansas from California by way of Missouri and whose mother was from Indiana, to help with the younger students in the mornings. Harriet was brilliant and methodical, and Elvira recognized in her the specific quality of intelligence that deserves to be aimed at something significant, and she wrote to an institution in Lawrence about the possibility of secondary education for exceptional students, which was the beginning of a correspondence that would eventually bear fruit, though that was some years away. Baby James came to school with her on some mornings, carried in a sling she had learned about from a Cheyenne woman she had met briefly at the general store, whose name was Morning Light, and who had been in town trading and who had shown her, with a few practical gestures and a lack of ceremony that Elvira appreciated deeply, how to wrap the child so both hands were free. Elvira had thanked her sincerely, and Morning Light had looked at her with the particular assessment of a woman who is accustomed to being looked through and was not in this instance, and had nodded once in a way that said more than several sentences. The children in the school were entirely undisturbed by the presence of baby James, who slept in a crate in the corner during lessons and was passed around during lunch recess like a community project. Thomas Webb, aged 11, was particularly good with him, holding him with the easy confidence of a boy who had younger siblings, and Elvira thought, this is what communities should do, hold each other's children, pay attention to each other's lives. Spring came again. Their first spring as a complete family in the house that Orville had built, and the farm produced well that year. The wheat was strong. The cattle herd had grown by 4. Juniper had a foal that Orville named April in honor of the month in which certain important things had begun, and Elvira's writing desk in the east window was covered in correspondence. To Topeka, to Lawrence, to a school board in Wichita that was considering new curriculum materials, to a woman in St. Louis who published an educational journal and who had expressed interest in an article Elvira had written about teaching literacy in frontier communities. Orville read the article in manuscript. He read it twice carefully at the kitchen table after supper with James asleep in the next room and the spring evening warm around them, When he finished, he set it down and looked at her. "This is very good," he said. "You are biased," she said. "Absolutely," he said. "It's still very good." She smiled at him across the table, and he smiled back, and James made a small sound from the next room that suggested he might be waking up, and Orville pushed his chair back and said, "I'll go," and she said, "Thank you," and watched him go and thought, "This is what I wanted." Not in the sense of a list fulfilled, but in the sense of a direction correctly chosen. This is the way I wanted to move through the world. By the fall of 1875, Caldwell Creek had grown. 2 new businesses had come in, a hardware store and a small hotel that served the growing cattle traffic coming up from the south. And the school had been expanded to include a second room, which meant Elvira could teach the older and younger children separately, which improved the outcomes for both. The town had a character now, not just the raw, accidental quality of a place that happened to exist, but the beginnings of something intentional. Elvira was a large part of that, though she was not the kind of person who tracked her own contributions with any vanity. Hackett sold his main ranch in the autumn of 1875 and left Caldwell Creek entirely. He sold to a man from Missouri who arrived with his family, and who proved to be an entirely ordinary neighbor, a man who fixed his own fences and paid his own debts and had no particular interest in anyone else's land. Clarence Webb, when he heard about it, sat down at his own kitchen table and put his face in his hands for a moment, and when he looked up his eyes were bright, and he said nothing because nothing needed to be said. Orville was the one who told Elvira. He came to the school at noon, which he did occasionally now when he had business in town, and told her through the window she was always cracking open to let in the air, and she turned from her chalkboard and looked at him through the window, and her face did that thing he loved, the thing where relief and satisfaction moved through her features so honestly it was like watching weather cross a plain. "Finished," she said. "Finished," he said. She reached through the window and squeezed his hand once, quick and sure, and then turned back to her class with the composed, purposeful expression of a teacher with 30 minutes left in a lesson, and he went back to his farm feeling as though the whole year had exhaled. In the winter of 1875, going into 1876, Elvira found herself expecting again. She told him in the barn this time on a Monday morning when she arrived. She still came on Mondays. She would always come on Mondays. She would still knock on the barn door 20 years from now, and he would still call "come in," and they would still drink coffee at the workbench like it was the first time. And she had the 2 coffees in her hands, having brought them from the house, and she held his out to him and said, "You're going to be a father again." He took the coffee and looked at her with the expression she loved best on him, the private smile that started in his eyes and came down to his mouth slowly, like a man who has just been given something he wasn't sure he'd earned. "When?" He said. "August, I expect." "August is a good month," he said. "James was October," she said. "October is a better month," he said, and she laughed, and he caught her laugh and kept it, because he kept everything she gave him. The second child was a girl born in August of 1876, in the middle of a heat that Elvira later said was entirely appropriate because this child came into the world like she had somewhere to be and was annoyed at the delay. They named her Clara because Elvira had asked Orville if he would want that, and he had been quiet for a moment and then said yes, and his voice when he said it was the voice of a man setting something down gently and finally in the right place. Clara Elvira Conroy, born August 14, 1876, who arrived in the world with a set of opinions she would never stop sharing. By 1877, the school had 22 students, and Harriet Chen, now 16, was serving as an unofficial assistant teacher. Elvira wrote the Lawrence Institution again, with more authority this time, and the institution agreed to review Harriet's work with a view to a funded scholarship, which would come through the following year, and which would be one of the things Elvira was most proud of in her entire professional life. Orville expanded the wheat acreage to 15. He hired a permanent hand, a young man named Eduardo Reyes, whose family had come north from New Mexico Territory, and who proved to be as good with horses as the best man Orville had ever seen, and who eventually, within 2 years, could manage the farm operations with a competency that meant Orville could take a Sunday afternoon and not feel the farm was in jeopardy. Sunday afternoons became their time. Sunday afternoons when James was old enough to walk and Clara was beginning to, and the Kansas fall was turning the fields golden. They would walk, the 4 of them, 2 adults and 2 children making their uneven way down the farm road, James running ahead and turning back and running ahead again with the specific energy of a boy of 3 for whom movement is simply the natural state of being, and Clara on Orville's hip regarding the world with the serious, assessing expression that she had worn since birth and which she had clearly inherited from her mother. "She is evaluating everything," Orville said once, watching Clara watch a meadowlark on a fence post with the focused intensity of a natural historian. "Good," Elvira said. "The world should be evaluated." He looked at her. She was walking beside him in the fall light, her coat open, her hair coming loose the way it always did outdoors, looking at the farm and the road and the sky with the expression she had when she was simply, fully present. He thought about April 1873, which was now several years ago and also no distance at all. He thought about how he had been crouched beside Juniper wrapping a sore leg and had heard 2 quiet knocks and thought he had imagined them. He stopped walking. "What is it?" she asked, stopping beside him. "I was thinking," he said, "about the first time you came to the barn." She smiled, the full smile, the one that started quickly and stayed. "The eggs." "The knocking," he said. "Nobody had ever knocked." "I know," she said. "You told me." "I keep thinking about it," he said. "I have thought about it almost every day since." She looked at him steadily. "Orville." "I know it is a small thing," he said. "It is not a small thing," she said. "That's why you keep thinking about it." He looked at her in the October afternoon, with James now far ahead of them on the road and Clara on his hip pointing at the meadowlark with one insistent small finger, and the Kansas sky vast and clear and full of the cold that was coming. And he thought that the small courtesies were the truest signals, that a person's character was in the way they knocked before entering, in the way they asked what was convenient, in the way they held things carefully and offered respect to spaces they had not yet been invited into, and that he had understood something about Elvira Ford in the moment before he even knew her name, and had spent the years since confirming what he had understood. "I am going to remember it," he said, "forever." She tucked her hand into the crook of his arm where it lived now as naturally as it had always belonged there. "Come on," she said. "James is about to run into the ditch." He went. He called James back from the ditch, and Clara pointed at the meadowlark until it flew, and Elvira laughed at something James said that was the kind of absurdist non sequitur that 3-year-olds deliver with the confidence of prophets, and they walked back down the road together in the last of the October light. The farm continued to produce. The school continued to grow. The town of Caldwell Creek continued to become, year by year, something more than it had started as a place with a library. Eventually, a small one established partly through Elvira's coordination with a women's reading society in Wichita. A place with a school that by 1880 had been officially commended by the State Board of Education. A place where Clarence Webb's Thomas would grow up and learn to read beautifully and eventually leave for Lawrence and come back with a law degree. Which was the kind of outcome that makes a person feel the long, slow weight of good work. Orville turned 40 in 1885. They celebrated at Martha Gillies's Martha, who had become as essential to their lives as the house itself, who was godmother to both children, and who had never once failed to have a pie ready for any occasion that required one. The table was full and loud, and James, who was 11 and becoming tall and serious like his father and furiously curious like his mother, gave a small speech that made everyone laugh, and then made Orville look at the ceiling with the particular expression of a man doing battle with his emotions. Clara, who was 9 and had opinions about everything and had recently informed her teacher, who was now a different teacher since Elvira had moved to a supervisory role with the county school board, that the curriculum required updating, sat next to her father and took his hand without ceremony, the way children do when they sense things, and he squeezed it back. Elvira watched from across the table. She watched Orville in the lamplight of Martha's dining room, this man who had been 28 when she knocked on his barn door, who was now 40 and had the particular quality that some men grow into as they age, the quality of having made peace with themselves, the quality of a man who has worked hard and loved well and built something real and knows it. His hair had gray in it at the temples now. His hands, which she had always watched, were the same stained with honest labor, certain of their gestures. He caught her watching. He looked at her across the table full of their people, their family and their friends in this Kansas town they had made their world, and he smiled. The private smile, the one that had always been hers and had never stopped being hers. She smiled back, fully, unguardedly, the way she had learned to do in barns in the early morning with coffee in her hand and a good man paying honest attention. Later that night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, she found him on the porch. He was sitting in the chair he had built himself 2 years ago, out of spare lumber and a Sunday afternoon, because he had decided they needed proper porch chairs and had simply built them. She brought 2 cups of tea and sat beside him, and they looked out at the Kansas night, the stars enormous and closed the way he had described from the cattle drives, and she thought about the word home, about how it was not a building but a condition, not a place but a presence, and she was surrounded by it. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "Same thing I usually think," he said. "The knock," she said. "The knock," he agreed. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her and she felt the solid, certain weight of it. "I'm glad I knocked," she said. "So am I," he said, "every day of my life." The stars were out in full and the night was cool and clean, and the barn stood quiet in the dark 30 yards from the house, built by his hands from boards he had cut himself, and the door that she had knocked upon was still the same door. He had never replaced it, though the hinges had been replaced twice, and the wood was graying now with weather and years. He had thought occasionally about painting it or replacing it, and had always decided against it. He was not a sentimental man by habit. But some things you kept. He kept the door. He kept the memory of those 2 quiet knocks, polite and certain and full of everything that was coming, and he would keep it until the last day he had, because it was the moment the world had decided it was not finished with him, and he had decided to believe it. She finished her tea. The night moved around them, slow and full. James called out once from inside, a dream, perhaps, or just the adjusting restlessness of an 11-year-old body, and Orville stood to go check without being asked, the way he had always been from the first, fully present and unhesitating in the things that needed doing. He paused in the doorway and looked back at her. "Come in when you're ready," he said. She looked at him in the doorway of their house, this man who had been built by hardship and loss into someone capable of extraordinary tenderness, this farmer and reader and builder, this private person who had let her in with the same simplicity with which she had asked to enter, no conditions and no ceremony. "I'll be right there," she said. He went inside. She sat with the stars for 1 more minute, just herself and the Kansas night and the sound of the farm at rest, the horses in the barn and the wind in the wheat, and the particular silence of a life that is full. Then she stood and she went in, and the door closed behind her, warm and certain, like 2 quiet knocks on a barn door in April, like a life beginning exactly as it should.